Yo guys, welcome back to the channel. Another day, another rant, okay? And today what we're going to talk about is the job market in Canada in 2024. And I want to share my perspective on how the job search has been going for me, as well as just a general perspective, I guess you could say anecdotal to some extent, hearing around I guess you could say my circle or circles of friends. And, I could pull up job data numbers right now in terms of the percentage of jobs that have been created that are in the public sector versus the private sector. But I don't have the numbers with me on hand right now, and I kind of want to rant off the top of my head. But what I will say about the job data is, and someone could correct me on this, but in the past 12 months, it's been about 75 to 80% of the new jobs created have been in the public sector, and the last 20-ish percent are private sector. So in other words, in Canada right now, most of the new jobs are public sector jobs, and a small percentage of the jobs are private sector jobs. And so I personally find that to be quite peculiar, mainly because, well, I'm not going to say I find it peculiar, but I find it disappointing and I find it frustrating, mainly because if you really think about it, if you are somebody who is attempting to upskill yourself, meaning give yourself more valuable skills, that you have more optionality because of the skills you've acquired, it's more challenging when you work for government because government tends to be behind the private sector, which means even if you do have a job in government, although it can provide you stability, it somewhat limits you in terms of opportunity because you're going to have less access to jobs that require specific skill sets because you haven't developed those skill sets. To give an example, let's say you're working in tech, and let's say you work in tech government. If you work at a modern tech company, a modern SaaS tech company, or it could just be a enterprise software company, but you get the idea. A company that comes off the top of my head is you could work for like a TikTok, for example, right? If you work for TikTok, the skills you're going to gain at TikTok as a software developer are going to be different than the skills you gain as a software developer working for the government. And so what's my point there? Well, my point is when you live in Canada, because there's so many public sector jobs, to some extent, it kind of keeps you in a bit of a cycle because one, the private sector jobs aren't many. So when you do have those private sector jobs, unless you're working at the upper echelon of companies, you're not gaining the work experience that would allow you to prosper and excel. Conversely, if you work for government, you're not getting skills that are up to date. So to some extent in Canada, you're kind of forced to compete in a very large pool of candidates for a very small percentage of jobs that would allow you to excel and prosper and gain skills that other companies strongly desire. And so to some extent, it's kind of a trap and it's kind of cyclical. It's like if you can't get the work experience you need to be appealing to tech companies, those tech companies don't want you. If those tech companies don't want you, then you're just in this cycle and you're in this loop and it just keeps going. And so I've just been thinking a lot, and the one thing that's been coming up in my mind the most recently has been the fact that if you're living in Canada and you're not working for the government or the mega corporations, the probability that you're going to have social mobility is extraordinarily low. Because if you work for the government, and I know many people who work for the government, the one thing that's consistent is they have job stability that's unmatched in the private sector because the private sector has been dying consistently in Canada. A lot of companies are going bankrupt, even not just during COVID. I mean, during that period of time, there were many, very many companies that went bankrupt. But even now, in 2024, when I'm making this video, the end of 2024, which is when I'm making this video, there is a load of companies going bankrupt. So if you really just take the time to think about it, we had tons of bankruptcies during COVID. Now we're having tons of bankruptcy in the current period of time, and we're not having private sector job growth. And so since we're not having private sector job growth, and we have a excessive number of companies that are going bankrupt, there are two events occurring which are simultaneously bringing pressure on the market and making it more and more and more challenging for somebody to thrive in Canada's economy who isn't working for the megacorps or the government. And if we're going to be honest, whether you work for the megacorp or the government, they're not different entities. They're the same thing because they work together. because you can't become a mega corporation without working with the government. You can't become a monopoly or an oligopoly without working with government. The rules and the regulations is what monopolies and oligopolies leverage to push out competitors and prevent it so that competitors can't enter the market. And so, if you're working for if you're working for a monopoly, it's like, again, we can call it private sector, and in some sense it is. But if you can read through the lines and understand how law works, it's interchangeable. You could in some sense say they're two peas in a pod. The difference isn't as extreme as one would like to present. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of ranting about this a bit. And obviously, again, different personality types have different preferences. But this is what I personally don't like about Canada, because my thing is this: when you're living in a country, you're going to have a variety of different skill sets and attributes people are going to have. And some people are just going to have skills that are better for the public sector. Some people are going to have skills that are better for the private sector. What do you do when your skills happen to be better for the private sector? You just don't have opportunity, or you have significantly less opportunity simply because you have a natural predisposition for those types of jobs. And so it's just like, or it could just be that your skill set is better suited for those jobs, right? And so since you have a skill set that's better suited for those jobs, the idea is that you simply don't get that opportunity. It's somewhat of a mind-boggling thing to even think about. And more and more and more, I really do believe those who work for the public sector don't really have a realistic view of reality, because they're in a bubble that, quite frankly, isn't a representation of the economy, because the economy is the production of goods and services, and the government isn't doing that. I mean, someone could obviously correct me and say, hey, there's this subset of the government that's doing that. Like, maybe there's like some small subset, but most of the public services, it's more of a maintenance task. For instance, maintaining public health care, or it could be maintaining the roads. It's not the same as a company that's producing goods and services, which unfortunately in Canada we have very many. We also have a very our GDP isn't great. Our GDP per capita is not good. Our productivity is the second lowest in G7 nations, only above Japan, right? So we have extremely low productivity. So, when you really just take the time to think about it, that's why, the job market in Canada is so grim. And I think that, there was an interesting statistic that talked about 80% of jobs being basically a byproduct of nepotism, meaning that if you get those jobs, usually it's from nepotism. And the number could be 70%. We could debate on what the number is. I've read a few articles about that. It could be 70 or 80. But the overall point that I'm making is like, if you have a small private sector and then you have 70 to 80% of the jobs being given by nepotism, I mean, what does that leave somebody who maybe changes cities, or somebody who gets married and has to move, or someone who switches university programs? It's like, how are you supposed to have any mobility if there are very few jobs, and of those very few jobs, many of them are given as a byproduct of nepotism? And then when you even go into it deeper, Canada isn't certain provinces are no longer united. So you even have division amongst different groups, meaning that beyond just the nepotism issue, you have, what I discussed in my previous video, which is the tribalism issue. So the actual pool of jobs that are available for people who cold apply in Canada is extremely low. And the problem with the whole networking concept in Canada, the reason why I said it's a problem is because if Canada was in general aligned under a value set, meaning people had shared values, it would be easier to do the networking, because then in that sense you could relate easier to the people that you're networking with. But if everybody is very much divided and there isn't much unity and everyone's kind of in their own pockets of society, networking even becomes a challenge. And so from my perspective, I don't actually see the angle that people are claiming is available when it comes to seeking an opportunity in Canada, when you consider the fact that most of the jobs are public sector. Everyone kind of knows that public sector jobs are highly desirable. Therefore, everyone is seeking out public sector jobs. And so if everyone's seeking out public sector jobs, they're the only ones really being created. Private jobs are basically mainly a byproduct of nepotism. It's like, where are the jobs for somebody who is, got like decent credentials, but isn't necessarily a superstar, who wants to enter the market and like get a piece of like the economic pie? From what I'm observing right now, I personally think that there isn't enough levers to pull to move to position someone to enter the market in 2024 unless they like I said, they're getting it either through nepotism or they're a part of some dominant, I guess you could say. Again, I'm not going to get into it too much, but the overall point I'm making is that most of the issues we're seeing now in Canada, it's part, there's many problems, obviously, like so many, like there's mass immigration, there is mismanagement of funds in government, there is the fact that the private sector is dying, there's so many issues. But I would definitely say one of the major issues right now in Canada is the public sector is too large and the private sector is too small, and it's creating a situation where there isn't enough goods and services being produced for the government to tax, and aren't enough jobs for people to work. And then you have mass immigration where more people are coming in, but there's not as an equal amount of jobs being created. And so and another thing too is, and I'm going to end this rant now because it is getting long, but I'm noticing that there are more and more extremely wealthy people who are immigrating. As there's a lot of poor people immigrating to Canada, but there's also a lot of very wealthy people immigrating to Canada. And when those wealthy people immigrate to Canada, they do not need, or they do not have any desire, or they're not required in some way to work per se. And so some of them come here and they will simply rent out a condo or property, and they'll just live off the rental income. And before anyone chimes in and says, dude, like, am I saying that's bad or good? What I'm saying is that a lot of the people here in the population, if they're not actually even looking for work, then it's kind of like you're still competing for resources with people who can kind of come into the market because of how lax our immigration is, and they could basically instantly start out competing you, even though you might be born here and you might actually have contributed for a longer period, right? And I'm not saying that I'm opposed to it as a whole. I'm just saying that because of how scarce everything is here, when you have more people coming at an excess rate, and those people have significant advantages to the local population, it in many senses pushes out the local population. It makes a dynamic where by me being born here, I have less advantages than someone who kind of comes in here, games the system, and sort of just surpasses me because of the fact that maybe they have more wealth, maybe they already have some sort of real estate connections. Like, again, this rant is getting very long. I'm not going to get into it, but I guess the point of my video today, and if you want to leave some comments and like the video and all that, but the point of the video that I'm saying is that I just find that now in Canada, there really isn't a private sector like there is in America, or even, quite frankly, other first world developing nations, because we've created, I'm not a part of this, but Canada has created a culture that is public sector first. And now that there's really no private sector, everyone who's like searching for work is competing for a very small amount of jobs that are low paying and taxed at a high rate. And so it's like, even if you get the job, you're taxed at a higher rate, and you're not earning much. And so it does kind of make it a fruitless endeavor, because if you somehow overcome all the issues, you're still going to struggle if you get that job. And so it's kind of like, what really is the incentive? Again, and I'm not saying that it's not worth it at all, but I'm just saying that it's creating a dynamic where I find it pretty hard to justify. I'm not seeing the rational argument for this setup being net beneficial for Canadian-born citizens. If you're born in Canada and you have to, navigate through this system, I see there being many more cons than pros, and I see that this could be avoided if the private sector was encouraged to develop versus the public sector. Anyways, guys, that's the end of my rant. Public sector versus private sector Canada. Please like the video, please comment, and peace.